So transitioning from that, let's generally talk about slavery in Islam versus slavery in Christianity. I have been told multiple times that there was slavery in Europe, and the person that really affected the abolition of slavery worldwide was the Prophet Muhammad, and Islam abolished slavery.
No, nonsense.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
Well, I would say yes, Islam did talk about rights of slaves. Islam, not just in Quran. I can give you many references. For example, allow me to quote Surah Al-Baqarah. I have here. It says, "Righteous are those who free slaves." It is a Surah Baqarah. Baqarah means 2177. Somebody wants to go get checking. I mean, it talks about many other things. One is also this freeing slaves. So Islam values those who free slaves, right? Again, another reference, 589, Al-Ma'idah, right? And so says if you break a promise, right? You made a vow and you broke it, then you can avert sin by freeing a slave, right? And then in Surah Nur, it talks about that you cannot force your slave to prostitution, which I mentioned earlier. It is mentioned in Surah Nur, and the reference is 2433. You can go check it out. So I think when Islam talks about it, Islam talks about rights of slaves. That is completely different from ending slavery or abolishing slavery. These are two different concepts. Yes,
Are you saying that like freeing a slave because you did something wrong does not necessarily translate to freeing all slaves,
yeah, generally you can
right? So it's like a
say,
more like a penance or something like that,
yeah,
right?
it's kind of like, okay, you have the rights to own the slaves, and when you break a promise, free one slave,
Right.
and then yeah, when you free a slave, then they have equal rights. So again, this all comes under the umbrella of giving rights to your slaves. It never ever in Islam it talked about abolishing slavery once and forever. It doesn't say you cannot have slaves. Uh, there is a restriction of slaves. Yes, rights are different things. As I mentioned, rights are completely different things than just saying. So again, going back to that argument, I would say, based on research I did, and it's not yesterday research for a long time, I think Christian ideas, Christian ideas were the principles behind abolition of slavery. That's the main argument. And I can give you the references like when in 1772, British and then the
Mhm.
MP were William Wilberforce,
Wilberforce, right?
right? He was pronounced, he was a very well known Christian, right, who advocated for ending slavery in Britain. And then Quakers, who were also a religious group in United States. I mean, it wasn't United States at that time, but it was the idea was Quakers' idea that slavery is non ethical, right? So I think it evolved in Christian theology, and then it's what adopted throughout the world, and of course, then now everybody thinks slavery is haram.
So let's talk about the timelines here, because I think this is important. So in the 1700s, that's when slavery was the abolition of slavery through the British Empire really kind of began in earnest. But actually, there was a massive impact on slavery in the Roman Empire, like long before that. So when the Roman Empire became Christians, lots of things started to change, including the treatment of slaves. So, for example, the gladiatorial games were banned because of the Christian emperors. The Bible itself doesn't explicitly say all slavery everywhere must be abolished, but what it does say is you were bought with a price, do not become the slaves of men. There is a single letter in the Bible that's written from one of the apostles to somebody who owned a slave, and his request,
Philemon.
Philemon, is that he frees this former slave and welcomes him as a brother. So the Bible teaches ontological equality between slaves and their masters. Now, people might want from the Bible an abolition of slavery, but the Bible is not primarily about political revolution at the time because they have no political power.
Right.
You are a slave or you are a master, and this is how you must see each other, must view each other, and treat each other. When Christianity came into power, it had massive impacts on slavery and like way reduced and almost abolished slavery in the Roman and later the Byzantine Empire. It's certainly still practiced in Northern Europe, especially through the pagan Vikings, and it starts to have some resurgence again in the Middle Ages once Europe is starting to kind of conquer more places. But I have a fun story about this. I was having an argument with an internet atheist about this one Friday afternoon because I knew that evangelical Christianity in England was a major force for abolishing slavery, and this guy said, "No, well, you see, Christianity caused slavery." So, okay, well, that's an interesting claim. But I realized I didn't really know how the Europeans justified slavery in the Middle Ages, because it's not a direct continuation of Roman slavery. It's a new thing. And basically, what happens, the first Europeans to take African slaves are the Portuguese. And they're buying them from Arab slave traders, by the way, because this whole time, the Arab nations and the Ottoman Empire have a thriving slave trade, including ships that will raid European coasts and sell Europeans into slavery in the Ottoman Empire.
And just to supplement that, you know when Saudi Arabia banned slavery, when Saudi Arabia's slavery was abolished?
1962.
1962. So that goes there. But I will respond to that. I have
and then the last country to ban slavery is Mauritania, which I believe that was in 81 or something. But my like fifth podcast guest, which you don't have any video for, was a Mauritanian guy who is active in the abolition of slavery in Mauritania.
Wow.
So it's like the timeline is long enough that you can talk to people who were alive and are still young, who were like active abolitionists in Mauritania. But the way the Portuguese justified slavery was actually through Aristotle. It wasn't through the Bible, it was through Aristotle. And Aristotle taught the concept of natural slavery, that some people just function better when somebody's telling them what to do.
Good Lord.
But it's like a logical observation if you deal with people for long enough.
And I think that's not the only point that whole slavery was standing upon. I think they were, again, just like in the previous section, we were talking about how you take things out of the context. I mean, given that the Civil War of the United States, the Southerners were also quoting Bible.
Yeah, for sure. But this is coming later.
And
this is coming later.
Distorting it, right?
We're still probably about 200 years before that starts happening.
Saying the argument is that even in Europe, for example, Spaniards were openly making people slaves, and
Yes.
of course they were Catholics and they have that belief. So it was, I think, the Martin Luther's ideas that further went down, and then people started thinking about those things. Before that, I think when it was Catholic Christianity, there was no problem with slavery overall.
And the reason for that is because Catholicism at the time was inherently syncretistic.
Yes.
So there was a lot of Aristotle in the Catholic Church, which is the argument they're appealing to. But even the Catholic Church dealt with this internally. So there's a guy called Cabeza de Vaca, who actually, we don't have all that much time for this, but it's interesting.
It's a great name, Head of the Cow.
Yeah. So before him, though, when they start colonizing the Caribbean, they start taking the natives as slaves, and they end up working these poor people to death because they haven't ever worked at the capacity that the Europeans had worked at, because, the chill island life. And a local monk decided that, okay, we're killing these people. We have to make this better. So then they decided to start buying African slaves to work the sugar plantations in America, because these people were soldiers, they're warriors, and they can handle the work. They're strong built. So the reason they were importing black slaves is because they thought they were being too cruel to the native slaves. And that same guy, to his credit, later said, maybe we shouldn't just do the slavery thing at all at this point.
Right.
But so you have the conquistadors who are going out throughout Central America. Again, I'm not Roman Catholic. There's lots of things I disagree with in Catholicism, but you got to give credit where credit's due. And Cabeza de Vaca crashed in Florida, was enslaved by Native Americans, and then basically kept working his way out of slavery, getting re-enslaved, traded, and eventually worked his way from Florida all the way down to Mexico, came back to Spain and requested an audience with the king and the queen and the pope, and basically wrote a letter, said all the world is human, and the things we've been doing to these people are not justified. So with the British, right, the British did not start slavery, but they amplified it by like a long way.
Mm-hmm.
So because the British amplified it, they had the biggest slave trade of all. But this was not done by like society as a whole. This is done by pirates. And I learned this because on Friday, when I'm in this internet atheist with this argument, I learned that the first Englishman to take African slaves was a pirate captain called Captain John Hawkins. Learned this 6 p.m. Friday. Noon the next day, I'm at a church barbecue and I meet this guy there. As soon as I arrive, my friend Patrick says, "Oh, this is my friend John Hawkins." I'm like the pirate? And he's like, "How did you know that? That's my direct ancestor."
Wow.
Um, so, so in any society, right?
This is the smallest of small worlds.
Yes. In any society, there are people doing things at the frontier of that society, right? There are criminals, and not just criminals, but like shady, say, intelligence agencies as well, right? Like we can agree that the CIA or Turkish intelligence or ISI does some shady stuff that doesn't represent the culture of the people. And sometimes when those things get exposed, the people of that country turn against their own intelligence agencies.
Right.
And that is exactly what happened in England. These pirates are taking slaves. There's never any slavery on English soil.
Never?
At least not since the 1600s, like before the slave trade.
No, I think the first pioneer, well, I had a reference here. It was Somerset versus Stewards. It was Mansfield, 1772. There was a lord. Lord means a judge, who said that this is wrong, and that's where it was first original document in Britain about like how slavery is seen as evil thing, and then there.
Yeah. So when I say England, I'm not talking about the empire. I'm talking about British mainland. So there's no like slave plantations on the British mainland. And there's a law from the 1600s that if anyone stepped foot onto English soil, they were automatically free. So most of the cases that happen in the British Empire, I mean, I'm sure people bought slaves and under the table.
This is not after William Wilberforce passed the law in the Parliament, and
No, this is before. This is before. What William Wilberforce is doing is trying to apply the general sense of things in England to the British Empire as a whole. So he has these tracts made which have a picture of a black man in chains with the title, "Am I Not a Man or a Brother?" Because he's making explicit appeals to evangelical Christianity. And because most people don't know what's going on in the slave plantations, because there's no internet, there's no cable news, you just hear word of mouth stories, and it's hard enough to know what's true or not happening in Gaza when we have pictures in X, right? Let alone 300 years ago when you can't go there yourself. But he goes and he builds this network about information and starts campaigning and manages to get slavery banned in the British Empire. And then England used its navy to stop the slave trade all over the world.
Okay, well,
yeah, it's also important to keep in mind, like, what about the Aztecs, right? Like, what about the Native Americans? I mean, they enslaved each other. The Aztecs enslaved other non-Aztecs. The idea of slavery to me is tied to the human heart, right? So the Bible says that we're slaves of sin, and sin, essentially is like the reason why you would want a slave in the first place, right? It's a way to dominate the image of God. It's a way to take someone else and make them not in the image of God, diminish them in the eyes of. Without getting into a whole big like it's a satanic strategy or anything like that, I think like we're focusing on this element of like what does it look like in Islam? What does it look like in Christianity? It's a very old idea.
Oh yeah,
right? It's a
from
very old idea.
beginning of
Right.
humanity.
And I mean, look at, the Bible, the book of Exodus, right? The
Yes.
Jews are slaves in Israel in Egypt for 400
400
years,
years.
right? And the only idea of God coming down and liberating slaves um, comes from the idea of what happened in Exodus, right? So, and then there are a whole bunch of rules laid out afterward about like how to treat your slaves, how to address slavery, like all throughout the Old Testament, leading us to, New Testament believers in the 17th century, like acting on it, and saying like this is not just like it's not just it's a crime against humanity, right? It takes the image of God in someone and puts them in a place of like dehumanizing them. There are lots of other ideologies in the world that do that today, um, but I think it's also tied to the human heart, right?
Yeah.
Slavery's bad, kids. Don't do it.
Yeah.
One last thing I would like to add, and maybe I will ask you both a little bit of feedback. Say, on a whole, if we make this argument that Christianity explicitly, nowhere in the Bible, says that there should not be any slavery, not explicit words, just like Islam doesn't, but all the people, all the catalysts that caused ending of slavery were mostly Christians. Do you guys agree with
I mean, globally, I would say that, you know, the works of Wilberforce, the American Civil War, particularly in a postmodern sense.
that? Right.
For instance, though, like the French, right? They took slaves, they sold slaves, but they also had like black citizens, right? There are black French men who were French citizens. So different places in the world addressed it differently and addressed like, like in the American sense, we look at slavery and we're like, slaves were black people, right? But there were also European people who were shipped here as slaves, like you mentioned, early on. The way that the Bible addresses slavery, you have to take the idea that you're talking about American slavery out of it. That particularly in the Old Testament, the idea is a slave back then is someone who has indentured their servitude for a short amount of time, right? So it's a 7-year period, and every 7 years you're supposed to release your slaves. So, for instance, prior to the Babylonian captivity, um, the uh, the book of Jeremiah talks about how the people were supposed to release their slaves um, in the year of Jubilee, right? So every seventh year is supposed to release. You're supposed to let your slave go free, um, and they didn't do it. So therefore, God rose up and punished them for not setting their slaves free, and that was part of the reason why they went into captivity. They agreed to do it, and then they like reneged on it, right? Like they said, no, we're not going to do it, and then they took them back. And there's this whole discourse by God about how this is unrighteousness, right? And this unrighteousness is just like the cherry on top of the sundae of why your hearts are corrupt, right? Like the things that you worship that are not me, Elohim, right? Like not me, but you know what I mean? Like not God. You're not worshiping God. You're worshiping yourselves. You've taken idols, you've done all these other things. So the way that you treat these people that I have commanded you to set free is you know, not in line with who I have called you to be, right? So there's no other religion in my mind and to my knowledge that sits there and says like every 7 years a slave is supposed to go free. Like it's a little bit of a side thing, but in answering your question, where does that come from, right? Like I've never read anything like that in any other book.
Yeah, we were talking about explanations, right? But anyways, yeah, we
So,
just
so what I would say is this, and this ties back to part one, is that if you're looking at the Bible for a book of rules, then you can twist that just the same way you can twist
Absolutely.
any other religion.
Right.
If you
And
go
that's
to
not to say there aren't rules.
right,
Right.
but if you're going to the Bible looking for the heart of what God wants, which is loving your neighbor as you love yourself, loving the foreigner as you love yourself. The constant admonition in Deuteronomy is, you were slaves in Egypt, therefore be good to the foreigner. So if you're seeking after the heart of God in the Bible, you will not have slaves, You will not become a slave. You will not take a slave. And you will be against seeing other people enslaved. That might look different in different times and places and how you affect that, but that's the heart of it. And that's why evangelical Christians have been so central to the abolition of slavery. And now that's not to say there aren't atheists, agnostics, and Muslims who've been involved in that, but the thrust has come from biblical Christianity.